Yogena chittasya padena vacham malam sharirasya cha vaidyakena yopakarottam pravaram muninam Patanjalim pranjaniranatosmi stuve Patanjalim vyasam shankaram cha munitrayam katra sutrasya bhashyasya kramat vivaranasya cha. So, we were dealing with the first sutra of Sadhana Pada that you find as the second chapter in the published books. But in the chronological order of spiritual practice, it comes the first. Now, the sutra is this: Tapah, Svadhyaya, Ishvara-pranidhana, Kriya Yoga. Kriya Yoga means the yoga of action. That is the first step, the kindergarten with which we enter the life of yoga. It's a very interesting, psychologically very scientific process. First, Patanjali knows our true nature. We are active. Our senses of action, senses of perception, mind, intellect are always active. Even when we are physically inactive, mind is active. Thoughts, speculations, ideas, so on. Now, how to direct this process towards yoga? So, you can start from where we stand. We don't have to make a quantum leap. We can begin our spiritual life from where we stand right now, today. So, these terms are defined: Tapah, Svadhyaya, Ishvara-pranidhana. These three terms, they constitute the yoga of action. In other words, it is the primary lesson for any individual who wants to start spiritual life. Not only in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, but in all areas in all walks of life, we can practice this. Three terms are used: Tapah. Tapah is defined as manasascha indriyanam cha haikagram paramam tapah. Means mind and senses of action and senses of perception, they should be trained to concentrate on a high spiritual ideal. Going beyond the present, how to link our mind and thoughts and ideas and actions to a transcendental spiritual ideal. How to link the present with the infinite. That's the beginning of spiritual life. If we don't link the present, the empirical, the everyday life situation to the infinite, then we will be just creatures. We will be helpless tools in the hands of destiny. Very often this destiny is determined by the vagaries of the senses and mind. I already explained this sutra in the last class, but just a kind of recapitulation. So the first step is Tapah. Now, here is an important point which one of the commentators, Vyasa, makes very clear in his commentary. He makes an important point. When we practice Tapah, means penance, maybe fasting, prayer, asceticism, self-denial, saying no to the senses, when the mind is running after some sensory pleasures, you should have the ability to say no to the mind, to say yes, enough. This is the beginning of spiritual life. Now, Vyasa, with a great psychological insight, makes an interesting statement. This should not be done in such a way as to create fatigue in the mind. So, he says, Tacha chitta prasadanam abadhamanam anena asevyam. It's a very interesting, I shall explain this. See, I shall just take one example. Sometimes we fast. we practice silence. These are some of the practices in all spiritual traditions: fasting, silence, long prayer, etc. Now, suppose when we are fasting, our mind is complaining, oh, you are hungry, you have to eat food. Then it is not a spiritual practice. Such people should better have a square meal. Go to a good restaurant, have a full meal, and then after some time, they can practice silence. Because if our mind is not ready to practice physical asceticism, then it becomes an irritant. So, Vyasa, the commentator of Patanjali Sutras, makes a very interesting statement. Tacha chitta prasadanam abadhamanam means mind should be always in a state of perfect peace, tranquility, harmony, and serenity. The serenity of the mind, the tranquility of the mind should not be disturbed when we practice self-control, penance. It's a very interesting statement. Again, as I said last time, we practice silence, mauna vridam is what it is called. Now, we won't speak for one full day. The idea is, maunam, the word is related to another word, means manana, means contemplation, the higher, the infinite, the transcendental. Along with that, if we keep silence, if we can remain silent, then it becomes a spiritual practice. But those who are not able to do that, those who have not reached that level of mental fitness, if they practice silence, there will be a big Bolshevik revolution taking place in their mind. They won't speak a word. Mind will be in a very turbulent state. There will be an October Revolution taking place, French Revolution, all going on within the mind. Because mind is terribly irritated. So Patanjali makes an interesting point. Whatever asceticism we practice, that should not be done in such a way as to create a turbulence or disturbance in the mind. The purpose is to create a feeling of peace, harmony, and serenity within the mind. That should be the idea. So that's a very interesting point that the commentator of Patanjali Yoga Sutras, the great sage Vyasa, makes in his commentary on the first sutra about Tapah. Svadhyaya is again another important thing. Svadhyaya, literally, in the conservative orthodox circles, means chanting of some sacred mantras. Om, or maybe in the Russian Orthodox tradition, church tradition, they have certain prayers. In many spiritual traditions, constant practice of prayer within, with perfect contemplation and concentration on the meaning of the words which constitute the prayer. That's also very important, not mechanical. So, in this context, the great commentators make a very interesting idea. Whatever we read, whatever we repeat, should be linked to our spiritual goal. So, when we read a book, Svadhyaya literally means one's own self-study with concentration and contemplation and full understanding of the meaning. That's the literal translation in English of the definition of Svadhyaya in Sanskrit, the commentaries. We should be able to read only those books which remind us that we are something other than these psychophysical mechanisms. We are higher than an empirical entity. There's a higher spiritual dimension to our personality. Now, from a practical point of view, there is a famous verse which gives in a nutshell the true meaning of Svadhyaya and the importance of reading of those books alone which help us in spiritual life, and the importance of not reading anything which create disturbance, which may create disturbance in our mind, which may take us away from our spiritual goal. The verse is this: Anantaparam kirad shabda shastram sulpam tadayu bhagavascha vignaha yat sarabhudam tat upasidavyam hamso yatha kshiramivampu misram. Is a very interesting, very interesting definition. Swans, there is an imagery given. Swans, kind of bird, big bird. They say it's a mythological belief, may not be a fact. If you keep milk in a vessel, milk and water, of course, milk will always have some quantity of water. Now, in that vessel, you keep milk and water mixed together. Swan will drink only milk and leave the water out. It's a mythological belief. Swan won't drink one drop of water. It has got an inner faculty. That's a mythological belief. It has got a faculty to discern what is good for it. Water is not good for it, so it will drink milk alone and leave out water completely. Now, similarly, this verse says, this comes in Panchatantra, a very famous work which was translated in English or almost in the early decades of 18th century. It's a famous book, available in many translations, translated to different European languages. Now, the meaning is this: life is short. You may live for 100 years. And there are innumerable books in the world. All books are not worth reading. All magazines are not worth reading. All essays, books, articles and poems are not worth reading for a spiritual seeker. If you go on reading anything that comes to your mind, then what happens? Disturbing ideas, conflicting ideas will get accumulated in the mind. And when we try to practice any spiritual sadhana, when we try to do spiritual practices, what happens? The ideas, the images, the pictures that have gone through our mind, that have come to our mind while reading essays, books and poems may re-emerge in the mind. See, you can just think of it, how it happens. You read a book which is full of sensational stories, violence, crime and so on, and you try to meditate immediately. Many of the ideas, dialogues, violent pictures, imageries, all will re-emerge in the mind when we try to meditate. When the mind is in contact with the external world, then these pictures and images may not come to the mind. When the mind is trying to withdraw itself from external world and try to draw towards itself, then what happens? All the accumulated filth and dirt will re-emerge in the mind. So therefore, we must have a discerning mind when we read books, articles, or whatever it is. And maybe this is much more important in this computer age, the age of computer, YouTube, and so on. Everything, every technology can be properly utilized. Every gift of nature, a gift of God, depending upon how you look at it, can be put to good, creative and constructive use. At the same time, it can also be used in the most damaging manner. So, this particular verse, which gives in a nutshell the essence of what Svadhyaya means, what Kriya Yoga literally means, says we must have a discerning mind, we must have an inner mental, psychological filtering mechanism. Whatever comes to our mind, whatever we see or whatever a mind comes in contact with, either through ears, through eyes, sense of touch, sense of smell, whatever may be the sense of perception, all they should be filtered and should be accepted only if they are good and helpful in spiritual life. In fact, that is the essence of Svadhyaya. And third factor is Ishvara-pranidhana that we have already described. Here, Ishvara-pranidhana is very important. Ishvara-pranidhana means self-surrender to God, surrendering to a higher transcendental reality. In fact, if one could easily surrender himself or herself to God, then spiritual life becomes very easy. Because whatever we do, whatever we think, with all this, the idea of God comes to the mind. So, the idea of God, the idea of a transcendental spiritual reality comes to the mind. It's a famous statement in a poem by Jalaluddin Rumi. He says, somebody asked him, how was it that he could feel so much of inner peace within? So his answer was, he who rests in God dwells in perfect security. So that's what we described last time when we described the 6 important aspects of self-surrender, prapatti. We already described in the last class. Anugulyasya sankalpaha pradigulyasya varjanam rakshasyadehi vishwasaha goptrutva varanam tatha atmaniksheba karpanne shadvidha sharanagati. A person who surrenders himself or herself to God should first of all have positive thoughts which are helpful in spiritual life, should avoid negative thought currents, should have a strong conviction that God is the ultimate protector and God is always with him or with her, and then should have a kind of self-resignation to God. You find such ideas in Narada Bhakti Sutras and also in the writings of not only medieval Christian mystics, but also in the great Advaitic, non-dualistic mystics of medieval Europe like Eckhart, for I cannot rest in anything that is less than God. Such ideas you find. I'm just recapitulating some of the ideas. Now we are coming to an important subject, and that's the purpose now. We have already described Kriya Yoga. Kriya Yoga is the yoga of action. The psychological method of giving a spiritual dimension to whatever we do, whatever we think, whatever we feel in our everyday life. Action at the mental level, physical level is inevitable, unavoidable. Every moment our body or mind is always active. How to sublimate this naturally active nature of our personality to a spiritual dimension? And for that, we should practice 3 important disciplines which constitute Kriya Yoga or yoga of action, that is Tapah, Svadhyaya, Ishvara-pranidhana. First of all, some penance, vows, self-discipline, and ascetic practices without, of course, disturbing the inner tranquility and serenity. Second, reading or coming in contact with only spiritually healthy, useful ideas. So whatever we read, it should be helpful in our spiritual life. Third, a kind of a feeling of self-surrender, self-resignation to God's will. This is a path which anyone can start with in spiritual life. Now, many spiritual texts explain these great disciplines. Many of us may feel, well, we are not able to fully practice these great values, these disciplines. When we try, the mind falters. There are problems from external world and there are problems from within our own mind. No. And at the same time, there are definitions, explanations, which give us the feeling that the idea, the goal is far above our reach. So how to practice? Here, Shankaracharya, the great commentator of Bhagavad Gita, gives an interesting explanation. The real purpose, relevance, and practical utility of Kriya Yoga is mentioned here. And incidentally, Shankaracharya is also one of the commentators on Patanjali Yoga Sutras. Shankara, Vyasa, along with Vyasa is the commentator, Shankara is the commentator who wrote the Vivarana on Patanjali Yoga Sutras. Now, in the Gita, if you go to the second chapter, in the 54th verse, Arjuna puts one question to Krishna. Now, and the question is this. Arjuna is not asking the question, who is an spiritually enlightened person? What are his characteristics? The way he puts the question is somewhat different. He asks the question, how does a spiritually enlightened person speak? How does he converse? How does he interact with the world? How does he move about? Siddha prajnasya ka bhasha samadhisthasya keshava sthidadhi kim prabhaseda kim asida vrajeda kim. How does he sit? How does he move about? How does he walk? How does he talk? You find this in the 54th verse of the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. Now, in response to this question, Lord Krishna gives a long list of some of the essential characteristics of a spiritually enlightened person. From 55th verse to 72nd verse of the second chapter of the Gita contains a long list of characteristics of great spiritual personalities. Prachakadeda kaman sarvan parthamano gadan atmanneva atmanatushtasthita prajnastu. Like that long list you find in short. A spiritually enlightened person is not worried about what happens in the external world. He is contented within himself. His joy, his happiness, his tranquility of mind are not dependent upon something that comes from outside. It is built on the strong conviction that he is the all-pervading Atman, spirit, the consciousness, which is immanent in all beings, which is all-pervading and omnipresent. It's a long list is given. Now, while writing his commentary on this verse, Shankaracharya answers a question, the question that we may raise while reading the first sutra of the Patanjali Yoga Sutra, the second chapter. What is Kriya Yoga? So Shankaracharya says, many of these ideas, these ideals, these characteristics, serenity, inner poise, balance, wisdom, all these are natural characteristics of spiritual personalities. And we have not reached them. We are taught that a spiritually enlightened person sits in a state of perfect tranquility of mind, peace and harmony within, is not disturbed, is not perturbed by what goes around him. He is in a state of perfect and complete contentment within. And we know very well that this is a very difficult goal, remote goal for us to reach. Now, how do we get any benefit by reading this? Shankaracharya, the commentator, says, these are the ideas, these are the virtues, the characteristics, which are natural for the spiritually enlightened person who has reached that level. But for others, these are the ideas, ideals, examples, and characteristics that we can slowly practice in our own everyday life. So what becomes the natural characteristic of those who are fully accomplished, who have reached the goal, who have attained to that stage, become the road, the path for us to take so that you reach that goal. That is the important. Now similarly, when we read, for example, the high ideals of Tapah, Svadhyaya, Ishvara-pranidhana, etc., which may appear to be somewhat difficult for people who had to work for 13, 14 hours a day in the office and then look after everything like that. We may feel that this is all right for somebody who lives in a forest. In this 21st century, what is relevance? Shankaracharya says, and he makes a point, Sarvatra hi adhyatma shastre kridartha lakshanani yani tani eva sadhanani upadishyante yatna sadhyatvad yani yatna sadhyani sadhanani lakshanani cha bhavanti tani. The meaning is this, I shall explain. He says, the great spiritual characteristics that we find in the life of great spiritual teachers can be attained through our own effort. Yatna sadhyani means what are natural to them can be practiced slowly in our own life. To give you an example, if somebody asks you, what are the characteristics of a physically strong person? Or let us say, a very better example I would say. What are the characteristics of a wise man or a wise woman for the matter, or a musician? Then you would say, a musician can sing well, a wise person can take proper decision without being shaken or being being influenced by negative ideas or anything. Now, if we ourselves start practicing some of these characteristics, so a good musician can sing well. For that, we take good lessons under a great musician and try to practice it. A good musician will have a good voice. So we try to practice so that we get a good voice. A good musician can sing well. So we try to practice singing well more and more. Then we also become musicians. A physically strong man has huge bulging muscles. So a person can start going to gymnasium every day and he need not worry about getting strength, becoming strong. He should concentrate on getting bulging muscles. And naturally he will become a strong person. So these characteristics can be practiced through effort. He means everyone can start and practice and attain these qualities through effort. That is the special view of the great teacher of Advaita, Shankaracharya. So we have now already discussed the Kriya Yoga, the first sutra, and the same discussion continues in the second sutra. These sutras are all interrelated, not separate. In the second sutra, there is a description of the real purpose of Kriya Yoga. It is explained in greater detail. Samadhi bhavanarthaha klesha tanukaranarthancha. The meaning here. Now, what's the purpose of this Kriya Yoga? Why should you practice this? It is explained here. Now, Samadhi bhavanarthaha. The purpose is to attain concentration, serenity, inner poise, etc. And for this purpose, we must develop a strong discerning mind, a spiritual discrimination between what is right, what is wrong, what is appropriate, what is inappropriate. And when this happens, what happens is klesha tanukaranarthascha. Means, klesha is a very important term in Patanjali Yoga Sutras. If you read Patanjali text, you find this concept of klesha is an important concept, which is essentially a great contribution of Patanjali. What is klesha? All obstacles, obstructions, difficulties that we face in our spiritual life can be collectively called klesha. That's a term used here. That's why when we discuss some of the sutras of the Samadhipada, we discussed vrittis. And vrittis, some vrittis are helpful, some vrittis are not helpful. Vrittis means modifications. Modifications which create obstacles and obstructions in spiritual life are klishta. They produce klesha or they are produced by klesha. And those vrittis and modifications that emerge through sensory perception, sensory contacts, are not obstructive, are called aklishta. So, this doctrine of klesha is perhaps one of the most unique and central point in Patanjali's system of yoga. It should be understood in greater detail. First of all, according to Patanjali, our mental life has got two important aspects. One is experience, the other is reaction to those experiences. In Patanjali's system, he calls bhoga is experience, and our natural reactions could be emotional or volitional impulse reactions, can be called either vega or udvega. You find these terms are used. I am using the Sanskrit terms because in many translations, the translators use the same term. Because if you try to translate many of these technical Sanskrit terms to English, that creates more confusion. So once we understand what bhoga means, there will be no confusion. So bhoga means different experiences that we have, that we go through in our life. Painful experiences and also its opposites, experiences which may not be painful. This is one aspect of our mental life, according to Patanjali. The other aspect of our mental life is our reaction to these experiences. These reactions could be either as an attachment, or it could be an aversion, or it could be running away from that experience. If we have an experience that is apparently happy, apparently, not necessarily really, but apparently happy, we feel an attachment. It's called raga in Sanskrit, towards that experience. And its opposite. If that experience is not a happy one, we feel an aversion, it's called Dvesa, the Sanskrit term. So if the bhoga or experience is unhappy, we will have an aversion towards that. If it is a happy one, we may feel an attachment towards that. Then there is a third type of reaction, which is fear. In Sanskrit word is bhaya or abhinivesa, which is a kind of fear. So if there are some experiences which we don't want to fight with because we are afraid, we won't go near because we are afraid. So fear can neutralize both attachment and also aversion. So we want to run away from it. So these are the emotional and volitional reactions that we normally go through. This is what is called klesha. So kleshas are nothing but emotional and volitional reactions. These function as either attachment or aversion or fear. Now, whatever we go through, whatever experiences we have, take either the form of attachment, we feel attached to something, we like it, and we lose our balance, that becomes a bondage. Again, we hate something, we have a strong dislike for something, that is also a bondage. So Raga and Dvesa are equally binding in their effect. If you hate somebody or something, the person whom you hate or the thing that you hate will be always be with you as a shadow. Again, if you are attached to something, obsessed with something, you have a strong liking for something, that also becomes a bondage. It also binds you to something, like a chain. Again, if you are always trying to avoid something, to run away from something, to fear, fear also is a bondage. These are obstructions and obstacles that are to be avoided, that can be neutralized through the practice of Kriya Yoga. That's the idea behind. Now, how to do that? The easiest and the most scientific instrument is self-surrender. Surrender to God. But maybe in this 21st century, if the moment you talk about God, then we may think of a mighty, all-powerful, uncompromising person standing or sitting somewhere with a mighty stick in his hand, or her hand maybe, threatening us with hellfire or promising heaven. No, that's not the idea of God here. Here, the idea of God is one who creates this world and who is the indweller in everything in this world, who is the immanent principle in everything, and who is also the all-pervading consciousness, the omnipresent consciousness, who is actually not different from his creation. The Creator, God, as the immanent principle within his creation, that's the idea of God in Vedanta. So remember, the idea of God is not so fully developed in yoga philosophy. So to make this yoga system much more intelligible, I sometimes try to synthesize Vedanta with yoga. Please remember, yoga is not a complete system as Vedanta. Yoga is a great means, a path that takes us away from the sensory world, the bondage of the senses, towards a higher spiritual level. And Vedanta takes you from there to the supreme goal. So, Ishvara-pranidhana is the third element in Kriya Yoga. If whatever you do, if you could do with thought of God in your mind, then you won't be too much attached to something, because attachment in its empirical worldly sense is the opposite of aversion. In a spiritual sense, attachment could mean you look upon the whole creation as a spiritual family. That is not attachment. When we use the word attachment, or Raga as it is a Sanskrit term, is used in Patanjali system, Vedanta system, means attachment to something or somebody accompanied by aversion to something or somebody. It's like a coin which has two parts. One side attachment, the other side aversion. Both are equally binding in their effect. Now, again, fear, the third emotional, volitional reaction towards our experiences. That also is a problem. If you are devoted to God, if you are feeling that, well, I have resigned everything to God, so God will see to everything, then you will not be afraid. In fact, absence of fear is a very important characteristic in a spiritual seeker. Fear and faith in God can never coexist, cannot go together. Fearlessness, not of a hooligan or a reckless person. That's not what is meant here. Fearlessness that comes out of a feeling of self-surrender, resignation to God's will, and everything is God's work, and God is your protector. If we can reach that level of spiritual progress, then we will be free from attachment, we will be free from aversion, we will be free from fear. So you can imagine how Kriya Yoga helps us to fight some of the very common problems that we encounter in our everyday psychological life. We are always attached to something, and that attachment, when it is at the worldly level, it has got another side to the coin, aversion, hatred to somebody else. And both create, third one, fear. Something that we cannot like, and something that we know very well that's no use getting angry with it, we avoid, we move away from it. That is fear. That is called bhaya or abhinivesa. Now, Patanjali says, this Kriya Yoga helps you to develop a discerning mind. That discerning mind, well, that spiritual maturity, wisdom, that's the meaning of bhavana, the word used in the second sutra. So, samadhi bhavanarthaka, klesas tanugaranarthascha. Tanugaranam actually means attenuation, weakening, making thin. So, once you develop this strong discerning mind as a result of the practice of Kriya Yoga, Tapah, Svadhyaya and Ishvara-pranidhana, then what happens? You develop a discerning mind, and that discerning mind is slowly weakens aversion, attachment and fear. That is the purpose here. A great commentator who wrote the commentary, Bhoja's Vritti, he says, Chedasi puna niveshanam, means thinking again and again. Whatever sensations may create fear or aversion or attachment in our mind, when these sensations or thought currents come, again and again we must try to neutralize it by internalizing this Tapah, Svadhyaya and Ishvara-pranidhana. Surrender to God, resignation to God's will, or reading good books and thereby accumulating good positive thought currents in our mind. So, what happens if you can do that? Then these klesas get slowly weakened. Klesas, we should understand. Klesa is a special term which is a contribution of Patanjali. Patanjali had many original contributions to psychology. One important contribution, as I made clear earlier, was the clear discrimination between vrittis and samskaras. Many external experiences create tendencies in our mind, and we identify ourselves with those things, and that create modifications. Modifications may be acceptable to modern psychologists like Jung, Adler, etc. But then they could never possibly think of samskaras. When these modifications get solidified, they become an invisible force within us with a potency to manifest again in the form of an action-oriented volition, which is called samskara, a tendency or a potency. So, how this system works? First, Kriya Yoga, Tapah, Svadhyaya, Ishvara-pranidhana. Proper mental training, concentration, practice of spiritual vows, and again reading of good books, accumulating our mind, mental system with positive thought currents, and a sense of complete resignation to God's will, and this creates a mental filtering mechanism within. So when something happens which makes you hate somebody, this spiritual mechanism will stand as an obstruction to that hatred. No, I should not hate. It's called Viparita Bhavana. Means you neutralize a negative thought current with a positive thought current. So when you develop this filtering mechanism, it will help you to neutralize a hateful thought current by projecting its opposite. A thought current related to love, affection. This is a whole world, this is a spiritual family. So if I hate somebody, hatred will come back to me. Whatever we give to the external world, it will come back to us. It rebounds on us. So we should not hate. And if we don't hate anybody, then we won't have too much attachment. Attachment leads to pain. You get attached to somebody, and when you don't get back in return from that person what you expect from him or her, then what happens? It leads to its opposite, hatred. Dvesa. Raga leads to Dvesa. Attachment leads to aversion. And the third, Klesa, fear, running away from it. So all these can be neutralized by projecting a counter thought. They can be neutralized by projecting its opposite thought currents. Negative thought currents can be neutralized by projecting an opposite thought current. You should remember, these are the ideas now they use in psychological counseling. Patanjali writes about it in 9th century BC. He's a great counselor you find here. So, again, this leads to Samprajnata Samadhi. We discussed this matter earlier. Samadhi we'll discuss later. And it creates a kind of spiritual maturity. And slowly, when the spiritual maturity comes, we are able to counter the emergence of klesas, hatreds, aversion, too much of attachment and obsessive attachment, and also fear. All this can be neutralized by this spiritual mechanism, which is Patanjali system. So now we will have interaction for the next maybe 10 minutes or 5 minutes, okay. So we can put forward ideas, discussions.
So you mentioned Vyasa's point commentary where you mentioned that if you're trying to do some tapah, but your mind is revolting and you don't have that tranquility, he said it's not a good thing. But at the same time, similar to that, I remember from Gita, one of the verses where Krishna says, what will you do by just abstaining, from doing something?
Vyasa's point is this. If we practice extreme asceticism, which upsets the balance, which is not helpful, not conducive to creating inner tranquility, which is the real purpose of Kriya Yoga practice, then it will have the opposite effect. As I said earlier, a person who is hungry and is fasting and becomes angry. As you find in P.G. Buddha's story of the slice of an orange, you find. It's a funny story is there. So a person who he was recommended by his doctor, who was a friend, he had a slight stomach problem, so he was asked to take only half an orange in the morning and evening. And on the first day he was quiet, he got rid of his stomach problem. He was in a very serenity mode. Next day he became very hungry, so he became angry. That's what he says. It may not be when we don't fully understand this. Whatever spiritual practice we do to an excess, if we can contain that, if it doesn't upset the inner tranquility, then it is fine. If it upsets the inner tranquility, then or peace, then it won't have the expected result. So you not only that, you are fasting and you will complain against all these people who are not fasting, who are having regular meals. You complain, these fellows are not fasting, see, look at me, I'm practice fasting. That's what happens. So this happens. You find some people who practice a little spirituality, become very proud of it. And I fasted for 3 days, and these fellows see they can't even fast for 1 day. That really creates Dvesa, aversion, hatred. So the opposite effect is produced. So Vyasa's point is that now we should not practice the extreme. Gita says, yuktahara vikharasya, yukta cheshtasya karmasu, yukta supna avabodhasya, yoga bhavati dukkha. Yoga destroys pain, sorrow, klesas, when it is done in a proper manner. So everything should be proper in a moderate sense. Extreme asceticism may not be good for those who are not spiritually or mentally fit for it. The opposite effect will be there. That's the idea begin. The purpose is to transcend the body level and the mental level. The purpose is to reach the spiritual dimension, going beyond the psychophysical dimension. If your practice brings you down to the psychophysical level, instead of taking you beyond it, then you should not do that. So the purpose of yoga is to take you beyond the psychophysical dimension of your personality. That's the idea behind. So if any practice brings us down to the physical level, see, if you're hungry, you become angry because the stomach is complaining. But a spiritually elevated person won't feel the hunger at all because his mind is far beyond the physical and psychological level. For such persons, it's all right. That's what Buddha found out during his practices, ascetic practices. So he also recommended this moderate path, the middle way. So the whole purpose is that we should go beyond the psychophysical mechanism, psychophysical dimension of the personality, should link ourselves to the transcendental spiritual dimension of a personality. That's the idea behind. Anybody, anything to discuss? So in the coming sutras, these ideas are made more and more clear. Patanjali's system is that he mentions one principle and then he explains what it means in the succeeding sutras. So the method is somewhat different from what we normally are familiar with. So, Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.